Okay, we are recording.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I thank Steve for suggesting the title, although I was the one who suggested the question mark at the end, an unhappy marriage question mark. Um, and there's a lot of unhappy marriages involving feminism. There are the famous essays, The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism back in 1979 that had a big impact in cultural studies at the time. Later, The Unhappy Hymen between Feminism and Deconstruction, and that was using the word hymen instead of marriage because Jacques Derrida post-structure, father of deconstruction, as people might say, was using that word as a metaphor, and some feminists objected to it and had their reasons for it. The unhappy marriage between feminism and post-structuralism. So I think what is going on in a lot of these things, and why it was so felicitous that Steve came up with that title, is that you have these fields, and one is going to become one of the big trends in the field: Marxism, deconstructionism, post structuralism, and intersectionality. That these will become these isms that a lot of humanities professors will start trying to apply to their work. And then feminism is this ongoing field, it's morphing as it goes along. But there always seems to be a disconnect to some extent between feminism and these other fields. And so, if you ask a typical humanities feminist professor what the problem is, they would say, well, evolutionary psychologists just don't read us. They don't understand what they're talking about because they're not reading us. And of course, evolutionary psychologists are saying the exact same thing. Feminists are not reading us, and frankly, there are feminist evolutionary psychologists. It's um, and so part of the problem really is that there's not enough of an exchange, and then the question is why that's happening. And so I just Yeah. Um, I don't assume everyone read the little piece I gave, sort of a little autobiographical piece I shared about how I got into this. But essentially, I say that I started reading evolutionary psychology because it gave me an understanding of myself and other people that I had not been able to find in cultural literary studies or psychoanalysis, which is the only so-called psychology that I would have encountered in graduate school at the time in the 1980s. And a big reason why I was always interested in literature was because I was very interested in people, why we do what we do. Like many students in literary studies, I was using the study of literature to try to work through issues in my own life. That's what we often do. Um, and actually, scientists do the same thing in various ways. And so I waited until I had relative job security before I began openly pursuing ways of integrating evolutionary psychology with humanities scholarship. And by that time, I was no longer seeing things only with the term evolutionary psychology. I learned, there are a lot broader terms that encompass what I like to do, evolutionary neuroscience. I mean, that's a big question for me. Is really evolutionary psychology the appropriate term to use for all of the ways that we can apply evolutionary approaches to human beings, to the study of literature and culture? Um, I was found very appealing the idea of scientific evidence. I had been I had been subjected to so many lectures by people just going on about things and they had their take on it, but it would become an authority, and it would start to become sort of doctrinaire in the humanities. People would talk, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and they would refer to the mirror phase as if what Lacan says about the way infants develop is a scientific fact, and it's all explained by this mirror phase. But then scientific evidence was showing that's not quite so true. The infant is having a sense of self prior to being able to recognize a mirror image, that not everything coming from these theorists, and that was called theory in my field, were necessarily, true. Um, so one of the things I started doing in order to get away with this was to turn to animal studies. I'd started out studying the history of feminist movements in France and relating them to autobiographical writing during the 19th century upheavals. And um, and then I switched to translating a play, which actually was a novel by George Sand, and that kind of gave me time to do extra research while working on the translation in these new fields. But by like the when I wrote about Darwinian humor, I was talking about representations of animals or the use of animal metaphors in Samuel Beckett's work. When I wrote the article on the Balzac short story, again, that's I was using animal metaphors. Two times I got to co-teach a course with a colleague of mine in cognitive science named John Long, and we published two articles. Well, actually, we published one article together on animal metaphors and teaching a course on animal metaphors. And then the second time we taught it, I wrote an article on the second iteration. Unfortunately, it's expensive to share a French professor with another department, so I didn't have many opportunities to teach outside of my department. But um, that was kind of how I got away with doing evolutionary psychology. The deal breaker probably was when I gave a talk for the women's studies program at Vassar called Evolutionary Psychology and Women's Studies. What can they bring to each other? That was, I can't remember exactly. I think that might have been in 2004, 2005. And I really was unprepared for the backlash. Um, the worst backlash I got was from people who arrived. I don't know if this was deliberate, but they showed up 25 minutes late after I had given a bunch of, like, I'd explained what I was doing and why and what I was not doing. Um, and I don't know, it was just the virulence of what people said. And really, I was very ginger about it, very tentative in what I was saying. So that's a question, that this raises. What's going on here? Um,
Kathleen, what did they
yeah.
say?
Well, the anthropology professor just told me point blank that what I was doing was heterosexist and racist.
Mm,
And what I was doing was presenting work by Sarah Hrdy. Um,
hmm.
I mean, no one can accuse her of being so, but I just don't think they were paying attention. And I just want to say that in an environment where course reductions are becoming more and more the case, staffing reductions, there can be a lot of competition between different departments and different programs and major divisions. And I think that this plays into it because at the same time, I was trying to start a comparative literature and culture program, and that I ran up against similar attitudes. And so not everything I think is based entirely on what people believe so much as how much they believe is wedded to an awareness of what opportunities they may have or lose, funding opportunities, teaching opportunities, like being able to teach outside your department, um, and of course, possible job loss. When the financial crisis came, one of the things the dean mentioned was that the only legitimate way to fire a tenured faculty member was to restructure, like to actually abolish a department. And the easiest way to do that is in foreign languages because you can take an Italian department and a French department, merge them as a department of French and Italian, and legally fire some of the teachers. Okay. So this is the kind of thing that was going on. And so I guess I just want to say this is not all philosophical and abstract and intellectual. This is grounded in very real um, material concerns.
Hmm.
So I think I mean uh, we could just start with anywhere you like. Um, Diane has a question.
You're muted, Diane.
Sorry. Not so much a question as an agreement with you, but a little story of my own, actually. So I'm a couple of years older than you, I think. And when I was in graduate school studying psychology, the idea of evolutionary psychology was anathema to most of the people around me. So it's not only in the interaction between fields, but interaction between points of view within fields. And I have to confess, I thought evolutionary psychology didn't sound very convincing at that point. It was another, I don't know, 30 years later that I really got into it and then became, pretty much a convert. Um, But I'm a little bit hopeful that this relatively new field of, uh, well, field, not a field, but more like a theory of dual inheritance, which, a lot of people are talking about nowadays, the idea that cultures evolve just as species do, and that cultures can, in fact, influence the actual physical evolution of the
Hmm.
species, and that the, of course, basic structure of the mind also is very determinative of culture. And so that these are an inseparable whole. So,
Culture is a product of the mind,
culture,
is a
partly,
product of the mind.
Many minds.
Many minds. Yes, yes.
yes, 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 of
Yeah.
course. And so, I just want to say that you've been on the front lines of one set of skirmishes, but there are others in the history of the development of these fields.
Maybe we'll have some other war stories to share. I have one, but I'll wait my turn. I'll wait my turn. Hank, Ken, and Rob.
Yeah, a few things. On the personal level, my compassion goes out to you. It
Yes.
doesn't go out to your to the perpetrators, but I wrote in the chat. I'll get back to, in our world of well, in my chat I said you were. Let's see. There's intergroup competition, obviously, because of whatever circumstances, and scapegoating, and you got hit. Plus,
Yeah,
my
I have
sense
a
that,
classic scapegoat mentality. I'm very easy to scapegoat.
well, I was thinking one of the reasons you might be easy to, I mean, I've been in many different situations, and people protect themselves, especially in academic or intellectual circumstances, is through cognition. Sort of Freud called it intellectualization, but it doesn't matter. It's like the left brain takes charge. And it's
Mm.
nothing wrong with anybody's left brain if it's a good one. I like mine. I like everybody here. But you need to use the right brain. The right brain has a little bit more presence, openness, a little bit of vulnerability, not too much. Just a little bit is enough to get people to scapegoat you. So I feel not badly for you, but I feel I'm sorry you went through it. But I also didn't know how prolific you were. So that's tree too, but you just talked to you didn't speak to the right people. Uh,
Well, I found this, I was coming here even before Pro Social World when Andy Norman was running a lot of them. Hello, Andy. Good to see you.
Catherine.
And that was really good. I mean, it was so nice to find people, my people.
I think what order did I say? Ken and then Rob and then me and then Andy.
Okay, I read one of the articles that Steve listed down here and in Quillette, and I was just shocked to see the ferociousness of one of the attacks. It was simply abusive on the attacks of one of the evolutionary scientists, and it was when I read that it was just yesterday that I finished a book club, hosting a book club discussion of this book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
Hmm.
And boy, that is the best example I've ever seen of emotionally driven ideation. So this is a tangent, I understand,
Hmm.
but
What attack are you talking about? Did somebody
oh
attack?
yeah, someone came and criticized the attacks on evolutionary scientists, specifically in regard to a binary, dimorphism in sex in Homo
Oh,
sapiens.
Oh,
yeah.
People who want to see it as a spectrum. And by the way, it surprises the heck out of me that David Sloan Wilson had someone on. I don't know if anyone else was at that discussion, perhaps a month or two ago, of someone who came on to argue that sex is a spectrum in Homo sapiens. And, there just doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. And this person was reasonable and said there doesn't seem to be any evidence. He says that the argument against it seems to be emotionally and ideologically based. And the person who attacked him just went berserk,
yep.
calling him a liar and a beast and all sorts of things
Yeah,
to the
there's a lot of
extent,
ad hominem attacks that happen in these sorts of discussions. Yeah.
very much. So anyway, yeah, so that's what happened. And so that was a perfect example of this. Oh my God.
Hmm.
We think we're rational, but we're not. The other thought that did come, I don't want to take up too much time, but a thought that did come up, this kind of bending of reality, um, for example, one of the articles made reference to uh, this this kind of I can't think of the word now, but this happening a lot in Twitter, where someone was being essentially removed from Twitter because this is back in 2018, I think before Elon Musk took it over. And I wonder if of someone being removed from Twitter because he made statements that opposed this new this whole new uh, analysis based upon based upon, you might say, left-wing viewpoint.
I would be
I
surprised if
wonder
someone was removed from Twitter for that. I would have to know
if it's
more.
you can take a look at the two articles that Steve said. It talks
Yeah.
about it in one of them.
Okay.
Well,
Uh,
what would get you removed from Twitter pre Elon Musk's takeover is different than what would get you removed from Twitter now.
well, that was a thought that I had myself. I wasn't going to bring it up here now, but the question I had was, I wonder if in fact there is removal from Twitter now, or whether perhaps things, well, we may have some negative perception of them. But this is way off the topic, so
Well,
I'm done
it
now.
is, and it isn't because I think what you're talking about, in a sense, to give it a broad brush term, is cancel culture. And cancel culture certainly applies at times to the espousal of evolutionary psychology and perhaps evolutionary science more generally. And certainly a hot button topic right now is the issue of, is sex binary or a spectrum? To me, it's a simple discussion about whether you're talking about sex or gender.
Right.
The answers are different, but it's highly controversial. Jerry Coyne, who is an evolutionary biologist at U Chicago, um, Professor Emeritus. He has a Substack called Why Evolution is True. And I encourage you all to take a look at it. He's got some strong views about things, but he has published quite a lot about the issue of is sex binary or not. But I think we have Rob and then me and then Andy and then Alan. Take it, Rob.
Oh, okay. Yeah, isn't cancel culture a an example of evolution in action?
Say more.
Well, it's a variation in social relationships, and it's obviously a negative one, and it's trying to stomp out other variations in cultural evolution. But what I wanted to say was when I was in graduate school, we were studying the importance of influence in literary traditions.
The
And it
anxiety
always,
of influence.
yeah, yeah. And it always seemed to me that was obviously an evolutionary process.
Hmm.
When you trace, how a literary tradition evolved over time, it's evolving. It never struck me as being controversial, but apparently it's very offensive to
I
some
just
people.
want to intercede before the next person, which is that if you study the evolution of literary influence and evolution, but you leave out women's writing, you have a very skewed notion of what's going on. And part of what feminist literary criticism did was actually go back to like the 18th century and say, okay, what were women writing? And then we find out in France, for instance, there were a number of huge bestsellers by women and that to understand what was going on with the men's writing, you had to see what these women were writing. So that had been completely erased. And you talk about cancel culture, but there is this, erasure of someone's presence, someone's voice, someone's perspective. Um, and feminist criticism was trying to restore to understand what was going on with this society. What were the ideas influencing the society? And it was discovered that, more than men, women were resorting to writing fiction to get across certain ideas.
Hmm.
So of course, it's evolution in action. Everything we do, right, is,
Pretty obvious that there's not much evolution without both genders or both
yeah.
sexes.
But one sex is not simply producing the babies,
Yeah,
Um,
no,
so
it's ridiculous.
One,
yeah,
one, one thing, I have two things I wanted to say. One is that I hope sometime before we end, Kathleen, you would also just give a brief description of what Darwinian literary analysis
sure.
looks like, because I found that quite fascinating, and I'm sure you can explain it
Yeah.
better than I can after reading
Okay.
two articles on
Yeah.
it. The comment I wanted to make is that of course, I'm a retired psychologist, not a I was an applied psychologist. I'm a mental health clinician. And there's a lot of resistance to evolutionary psychology within applied psychology. Less so, I think, in maybe traditional academic psychology, people that are just doing teaching and research. And I think it's worth thinking about what is the threat that the tenets of evolutionary psychology pose that stimulate such resistance. And
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's, at least in my field, um, I think it stems from one primary threat. Um, People that are spending their lives trying to help people change, which is an extremely difficult task, are going to be extremely threatened if they perceive, or in this instance, I think misperceive, a theory of human nature saying that people are unmalleable, that they come hardwired and change is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. That's a that's a direct sort of ego investment threat to people who are trying to help other people change. That's, of course, I think we understand a misunderstanding of what evolutionary psychology says, but I think that's what they hear, and that poses a threat. I've had conversations with people that are pretty antagonistic and to evolutionary psychology, and try to explain to them that's not what it says, and that if if you want to change people or change society for that matter, you need to know what you're up against. And what you're up against is human nature, or more accurately, certain predispositions in human nature. And even that doesn't seem to, I haven't had much success in changing anybody's minds if they're opposed to evolutionary psychology. But I do think that's what the threat is. They think it means that people can't change. And as well as
The
the naturalistic fallacy is another threat, which they think that we're saying
Yeah.
what is
Actually,
should be.
the article that we published on animal metaphors actually addresses what the resistance can be in a lot
Okay.
of cases. And one of the things we relate it to is terror management, because the idea that we're animals is the
Ah,
idea that we're not special. That
mm,
um, and
yes, there's
so
some
yeah.
species-based hubris in the
Yeah.
resistance as
Yeah,
well.
that humans, we define ourselves in opposition to animals.
Right.
I think I can get in some points about literary Darwinism, but I think with each person speaking, I might be able to try to do that a little,
Okay.
rather
Okay.
than
let's
bore everybody with an
It's not, no, Kathleen, it's
Yeah.
not boring at
No,
all.
not at
Okay,
all. I
good.
think you
I
should
don't
Okay.
do
think.
it.
Yeah,
I guess I love hearing what people have to say, so
I like to
Andy
hear what you have
Allen,
to say.
Andy Allen and Hank.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, just to build on what you were saying, Steve. I think Darwinian ideas, evolutionary ideas, have always been threatening from the very beginning. They were a threat to religious orthodoxies. When biologists began seeing if they could use evolutionary theories to explain behavior and psychology, it originally was called sociobiology, and there was a backlash even among biologists like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard. I think the field of biology has kind of come around, and many psychologists are coming around. But of course, there's lots of pushback within psychology, and maybe even more pushback in the humanities. Um, I think that part of the explanation has got to be that a significant portion of the humanities have become very ideological over the recent decades, and they treat challenges to their core convictions as threats rather than as opportunities to learn, and thereby cut off their own possibility to. And of course, when you feel threatened, you're much more likely to try to cancel or react intemperately, and which is destructive of healthy discourse and learning.
Mhm.
So I think all of these forces are at play, Kathleen, were probably in the background when your personal story played out. But I want to congratulate you on following your, I think, rightful conviction that there really is explanatory merit here, that this intellectual tradition has a lot to offer us, and that it's important that we not be cowardly in the face of persecution uh, and resistance. So stay strong and keep the
Mm.
faith. We know you're on the right track, even if it'll take others.
And I want to second that. I actually emailed Kathleen personally and just told her how much I admired the courage that it must have take I have a sense of probably what Vassar is like, and it would take great courage to stick by your guns in all of this. So I admire you for that. Um, Alan, Hank, and then Hank. I don't hear you,
I
Alan.
can't hear you.
You don't look muted, but should we go to Hank and then come back
Go
to
to
you?
Hank and
Okay,
we'll come
Hank.
back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I wrote it in the text, but I hope we can take this aspect, this resistances or whatever title, and make it a topic of discussion at some point, because it's we've got good ideas here. But let me suggest some of the resistances that I've been reading about, not in the order of importance, but the quest for certainty,
Yeah,
the
absolutely. Yeah.
identity diffusion. My identity, like at Vassar, is like it's some called it a sacred value. What I believe in is who I am, and I got nothing else. That's the most important thing for me. And I put it as it gets hijacked as a survival mechanism to survive, and and status, and that's the other. And what did I say? There's also let me just read it properly. Sort of this there's a lot of literature coming out about perpetuating ignorance, and so I've been reading into that for a while. And we all talking about it, perpetuating ignorance in different structures and different societies. But I think that quest towards ignorance is part of the old brain. The less you know, the better. If you want to distinguish a snake from a stick, you don't want to take a look at how beautiful structures that snake is and how pretty it is and how it swallows. So you'd rather think, well, if it's a stick or a snake, I think it's a snake. I'm getting the hell out of here. So this ignorance, it may not be, is a survival mechanism. So I just want to add those three, but I hope we can do future discussion on it. It's so valuable. Yeah.
Alan, are you able to? Alan's hand is up.
Can we hear you, Alan, yet?
We
No.
still can't hear
No.
you. No.
No, you want to put something in the chat,
Yeah, in the
maybe?
chat. I think, Hank, all of these things that we could say this in general ways for many fields. I mean, wasn't there at some time, there was a debate for a long time about whether birds evolved from dinosaurs, and there was the camp, the pro
Mhm.
camp and the con camp, right? And this, I mean, I remember reading that this was really intense and full of hatred for the other side.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that applies to a great many things. So, I think what interests us for our discussion is what is specific to these topics, that arouses so much. And we've talked about, the discomfort evolutionary theory gives rise to in people. But I have to say, most people, most academics in my field, including at Vassar, will say, "Oh, of course I embrace Darwinian evolution. I just reject this notion of psychobiological sex differences or various things like that." So here, I think one of the things we have is a problem, a communication problem, which is that even when they venture to look at each other's scholarship, they don't understand what's going on. That's one of the problems. So a person might think they understand Darwinian evolution because they took biology in high school,
Mhm.
but they're not prepared. They don't realize a lot of the things. The idea that evolution is jerry-rigged, the idea that there are recessive and dominant genes, like all kinds of things that they just would have to really be more familiar with before they could understand what someone was getting at. Another is that evolutionary psychologists have, when they weren't actually making bad assumptions, they would use language that was really unfortunate. And that this would really be off-putting to literary people who expect more subtlety and nuance when discussing things to do with human behaviors. Um, and then when people in my field or humanists, when they use language, evolutionary psychologists don't get the same way they're using language. And so if someone in my field uses the word incest, a biologist is going to think one thing with that. And that's not often what people are getting at in my field. Um, Another issue is statements. For instance, Jacques Derrida made the statement, well, I'll translate it better than it has been translated. It has been translated as there is nothing outside the text. Okay. The original French, a better translation would be there is nothing extra textual. But either way, Derrida is not saying that the only reality is the reality in our heads. And a lot of evolutionary psychologists trying to critique Jacques Derrida, and I'm thinking of also Jordan Peterson, who talks about post-structuralism or postmodernism as if it were some kind of unified set of beliefs, which it is not. They don't understand what he's really getting at. What Derrida is saying is that yes, there's this reality out there, but we can only ever apprehend it by inserting it in the narratives that are our models of the world. And that's actually not very different from what evolutionary psychologists are getting at either. We have models of the world. We don't have a direct, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between our model of the world and the actual reality going on out there.
I'm
So,
reminded of the famous line from the old movie Cool Hand Luke, where the
oh
prison
yeah.
guard says, "What we have here is a failure to communicate."
That's a great line.
Hmm.
That takes me, I think I was 14 when I saw that movie.
Yeah.
Diane, I'm going to take this one, Hank, because I saw
I'd
Diane
like
raise her hand.
to go back to what Steve was talking about because I think it's really sort of fundamental. The idea that people are afraid of the idea that they can't change other people is a subset of the idea that people can't control people, either through persuasion or politics
Mm.
or something else. And I think, most intellectual enterprises are actually directed towards some kind of persuasion,
Hmm.
trying to tell people this is the right way to think. And the idea, your story was inspirational to me because it showed openness that hardly anybody shows.
Hmm.
Well, one
And
thing I couldn't go up against was rumors. I just couldn't defeat rumors. Go on.
Such as,
yeah,
Kathleen, are you willing
uh,
to
I
but
share?
What were
interrupted
they?
Diane, so I just,
but within psychology, there's been a great deal of resistance to everything that has come along that's new.
Mm.
I've been in the field for more than 50 years now, and I've also been a teacher of history of psychology. And it always goes in waves from one orthodoxy to another one. And the hostility between different factions and camps is unbelievable. In the specific case of evolutionary psychology, Edward O. Wilson was the first guy to do a real, statement of the idea of sociobiology. And he was literally not allowed to speak.
Hmm.
He got up to talk about his ideas, and somebody dumped a pitcher of ice water over his
Hmm.
head. And this happened back when I was in grad school, and I thought, this is weird.
so that's
But
very much what's related to what's going on right now in our culture, really. I
yeah,
mean, the
yeah.
idea that as soon as somebody is outside of your us, they're no longer human. They need to be exterminated. I mean, this is the
So
There's probably an evolutionary
yeah.
explanation for
yeah.
Well,
that.
academics form tribes.
Yes,
And then we have intertribal warfare.
yes.
But
I
there are
read that
reasons why
book,
in this
Steve.
field it's very hard. It's very hard to learn all of the science and learn all of the humanities approaches and theories, and then to look for the points of contact and find a way to communicate what you're doing to people in both fields, or, I'm saying both,
Yeah.
multiple fields. It's very, very hard.
It's somewhat more distressing to me in the social sciences compared to the humanities because the social sciences are sciences, and the lack of exposure to evolutionary science. I mean, you can get a PhD in psychology in this country without ever having any exposure to evolutionary science, even just straight biology, evolutionary science. None. Anyhow, I jumped in the queue. I shouldn't have done that. Ken, Scott, Hank, I think. Forgive
Yes.
me if I'm
Okay, I'm
going
gonna
out of order.
I'm going to step out on the limb and speculate that what we're seeing here is an ideology that comes out of a very strong social justice position. The idea that a very strong egalitarian viewpoint, that everyone is exactly the same, everyone has the same abilities, everyone has the same potentials, and the idea that that may not be the case, that different people, perhaps even different groups, might have different talents or different limitations, is a direct threat to that very strong egalitarian ideology. And so that's the result. That's just an observation. Any thoughts on that?
I really hesitate to address, I mean, I think I agree with you that there's a social justice motivation here. I don't think it comes out of a belief that we all start out um, the same and that culture is the reason why some people achieve more than others. I think there's a recognition that, different people, not different groups, but different people are going to have different abilities or skills. And I think that the rush to equate evolutionary psychology with um, claiming that there are, um, let's say, differences in intelligence. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I actually don't think that's what it's a viewpoint that's been expressed by evolutionary psychologists. It certainly doesn't represent all of evolutionary psychology, and it's not what I think either. But the thing is that there has to be an understanding of the effect of culture and environment, and evolutionary psychologists really fall short on that. When I go to talks on them, and like they'll say, okay, if you look at these Scandinavian countries in which they do all they can for women to be able to enter any field, but look what happens as soon as you give women a chance, they're going to opt for more traditional feminine fields. And then they draw the conclusion, therefore, it's just natural that women are going to want to do this field and that field. This doesn't take into account certain things. If women have children, there are certain jobs they're just not going to be able to find a replacement. You can't have somebody replace you for 6 months or a year if you're in a certain kind of indispensable job, right? So it really isn't necessarily about women being choosing naturally feminine jobs. If they're going to have children, there are certain jobs that men are going to be able to have because they don't go on maternity leave and therefore, I mean, because they get pregnant and have to have the child. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is the evolutionary psychologists often rush to a conclusion about something without taking into account cultural environment. And I think this is really upsetting to people who care about social justice, including myself. I mean, that's upsetting to me. The only difference is that I don't go screaming and pouring water on them. I go to the conference and I say, "Well, have you considered this?" You know? And I see other women at these conferences who do that, and that's what we need to do. Um, so we have a lot more in
You're
the
muted, Steve.
I
well,
think.
can we hear all from all the people who
Oh
are
yeah,
still waiting to
I'm
speak?
trying to manage the queue here.
Yeah.
And I
Okay.
think it's Scott, and then we'll go to Alan because he's hopefully fixed his audio. So Scott, Alan, Andy, Chris, Hank. Forgive me if
Actually, Hank was ahead of me.
okay. Well, Hank, okay, Hank, Scott, and then we'll go from there. You're muted, Hank.
No, I just want to pass my part to all the people who haven't spoken. So I'll go last.
Okay, Scott.
Well, this is probably going to be a little out of left field, I guess, as is my habit. The discussion here seems to be a lot about, I'll just say, irrational responses to evolutionary psychology, people that clearly don't understand much at all about it, but nonetheless critique it sometimes, viciously. Um, So when I was preparing for this, I know very little about evolutionary psychology. It's one of the things I'm learning here. But I did become aware of what appears to be a pretty significant split between, I'll say, strong and weak evolutionary psychology. And that, in terms of why is there resistance to it, that probably in a thoughtful discussion ought to be part of the discussion. And then the second thing there, I guess, in relation to that, is those two camps are then tied into a similar split in evolutionary, I guess, theory. On the one hand, the strong evolutionary psychology people aligned with the modern synthesis, and the weaker aligned more with the extended evolutionary synthesis. So, and that's a pretty significant uh,
Yes. Yes.
gap in evolutionary thought.
Mhm.
So, anyway, that's probably not appropriate for here, but I just thought
Well,
maybe.
it is appropriate, and that's
It
a great
is.
observation. Thank you, Scott. Um, Alan, and then Chris, and then Andy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I'm now here twice because I'm in on my phone to get the sound. Um,
Okay.
well, okay, so I've got about 15 or 16 different responses to what I've heard so far. The so I my career was analyst, coder, supply chain manager, et cetera, et cetera. But what I was reading rather than algorithms was Gregory Bates and Stephen Jay Gould. Evolutionary biology has
Mhm.
produced such a wealth of systems that ignore it in favor of something somebody invented last week seemed to me sort of callow. But and I really love the shootout between Gould Lewontin and Ed Wilson because I like both of them. And ultimately, I think Ed Wilson won, and I think we can say the good guys won, or the good guy won, because he was certainly temperate and his opponents were not. So I would love to get into the gender thing, and but I don't know if that's a side. I think there's too many things going on simultaneously here. The one thing I wanted to throw in is there's a distinction between behaviorally modern Homo sapiens and physically modern Homo sapiens. And the theory was that there is some mutation that happened a couple 100,000 years into physically modern Homo sapiens that produced behaviorally modern Homo sapiens because suddenly culture begins innovative. There's fish spears and big game hunting spears. And so there's an ongoing, well, my inspiration, Cecilia Hayes, I put a note to a book of hers and has pointed out that current archaeology is pointing out the things that are called behaviorally modern human beings flickered in and out of existence over a couple 100,000 years. So there's this ferment period in which culture, language, a lot of the things that we do emerged from a really static culture. Stone tools and fire, hominids pre-human had that. And it was really stagnant. And suddenly things caught fire. Her theory is that there was enough social density to sustain culture. But I find that particularly fascinating because it's where culture starts really lifting out of the genetics. And so I think that's a really rich thing to look at. And I also think gender is a really rich thing to look at. I mean, I think I'd come in sort of in opposition to Ken. Certainly germ tissue, week 6 either is egg or sperm producing. But there are, pre-genetic analysis, there are people who even the primary sex characteristics presented as the opposite gender or of ambiguous gender. And the whole thing is so shaped by estrogen and testosterone that once you get out to secondary sex characteristics, it's a much wider range. And then once you throw in the cultural overlay, all the complexity of that, just trying to tease it out, I think points directly to the type of things you're talking about, Kathleen.
I just have a couple things. Like one is the gender thing is really so interesting, and obviously it's the hottest part of this. The most likely to fan the flames, in addition to race, right? Um, uh, so I was thinking like maybe some later session, I would be happy to run a session on Darwinian literary criticism, because that is just, it's not just,
Yeah.
sex differences and but I'm just thinking what you were saying about culture. I mean, I'm looking in the feed and someone says there are sex differences in choice of college major before child raising is an issue. Well, child raising is going to be an issue for from the moment a child comes into culture. There are going to be all kinds of cues and messages. So it's just because child raising becomes a personal, conscious issue for a female choosing what to do in life. It's sort of like at what point do people have an idea of what's possible or not as they're growing up? And this is where I think Simone de Beauvoir is helpful, that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. That we are born in, we have these bodies, and then the way we develop has a lot to do with the way the world responds to us based on their perception of the body we inhabit. Like that's what's going on a lot of the time. Um, so anyway, I would be happy to do a Darwinian literary criticism one later
Before
on.
before
You
we
know?
end, before we end, just describe it to
Yeah.
us a little bit at the end. But Chris has been very patiently waiting. I want to let her jump in.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Okay, so I go to a Unitarian Universalist congregation. They're very liberal. They're very humanist for the
I was
most.
raised Unitarian.
Okay, so you got it. And I think beyond academia and various fields, I think there's an issue in that religious space as well, even in that very liberal religious space, because gender, race, and social justice are very big in those spaces. But there's also uh, this belief that your values, your moral character, your and even the sense that things have to somehow go in a good direction. And that, well, if everybody, if everybody's just the good person they know they're supposed to be, then life will be better. And I just keep wanting to go up to them and say, but evolution, we have to talk about how people are designed, how people came into the world and what they're dealing with. And I'm afraid to do it.
Mhm.
So anyway, because I feel like I have to figure out exactly how to say that. It's like, your sermons aren't going anywhere with me because
I joined the Quakers instead because the Quakers, it's almost like an understanding of human nature is built into the book Faith and Practice, like what to do when there's conflict, how to manage. Like it's gone on for so long, they have a whole set of practices that to me are really consonant with how to. And with Unitarians, I would often, when I tried to go to Unitarians, it often like they didn't have a very clear way to manage conflict or
Oh,
but
my
this
my
is not to put down Unitarians. I just also
yeah.
like more quiet than I get. Unitarians are very noisy and I need more quiet on Sundays.
My experience at a Unitarian fellowship that prides itself on tolerance, right? That's one of the hallmarks of Unitarianism. You could stand up in the congregation and say that you were a witch and be accepted more easily than if you stood up and said you were a Republican.
that's absolutely true.
Yeah. Anyhow, Andy, Hank.
Yeah. Um, so we've been kind of working around this question of why is it that there's so much that the importation of evolutionary ideas into psychology and the humanities, why does that arouse such resistance? And I think Steve got to the heart of it when he said, many people find that threatening in one way or another. A little bit of context. Plato observed way back in 2,400 years ago that when disagreements arise in mathematics or basic science, you do the math or you run the experiments and you solve them. And people generally, their pretty well understood ways to resolve differences of opinion in those fields without coming to blows. But that when we try to resolve questions in ethics, politics, theology, questions on gender, he didn't mention that one. I'm just throwing that one in. The tensions run higher, right? Emotions run hot. And of course, when you try to study human nature scientifically, you're looking at facts rather than values. And in principle, the facts are the easy ones to settle. But the facts about human nature have profound implications for what we ought to do, which makes them kind of values adjacent or ethics, politics, and theology adjacent. So, of all of the different sciences, the one that
Well, Andy,
rouses.
isn't that the naturalistic fallacy you just said? That findings
No,
about
I think you're saying fact adjacent. I think I know what you're getting at. You're saying you have to take these facts into account if you're going to address what we ought to do.
yes.
That's right.
Not
So,
this fact means we should all
yeah,
do, you know.
if I were claiming that the right answers to our value questions could be answered with deductive logic from facts about human nature, then there might be a naturalistic fallacy here.
Yeah.
But my claim is weaker, just that facts about human nature certainly have probabilistic implications
Yeah.
for the way we should live. And so I think there are ways to avoid the naturalistic fallacy here, but also bring the findings of the sciences and the methods of the sciences to our most divisive political, theological, and ethical questions. And in fact, I don't see humanity evolving past this era of our regrettable tendency to go to war with one another when differences arise until conflict resolution mechanisms comparable to the ones developed in mathematics and the sciences are employed regularly to resolve questions in these other domains. This was Plato's vision 2,400 years ago. Why don't we resolve our ethical questions using some of the same strategies that work so well in mathematics? It's taken a long time, but we're starting to see what that project might look like.
Yeah. I guess his student Socrates, it didn't work out too well for him.
Kathleen, you're in a long tradition of noble striving in this regard.
Andy, you wrote about Socrates. He just forgot to help people figure out how to do it his way. He just criticized them. Do you remember that in your book?
I did, yes.
That stuck with me. I don't know if people know that. Yeah.
Of course, we have to be in a situation where philosophers are not just selected out as being not appropriate for a curriculum, right? I mean, I don't know if
But the thing is, to get to the bottom of these issues, you have to do philosophy. Whether or not you're a professional philosopher, you have to drill down to the level of basic assumptions, very
And a
fundamental
lot of
assumptions.
literary critics are would-be philosophers. They want to interpret a text and kind of make it show that this is the way we are, or this is the way things should be, from the, starting point of a work of fiction someone wrote.
Yeah. Well, and from that standpoint, if you're used to doing things that way, then evolutionary psychology and evolutionary literature studies look like an incursion by a invading force to try to replace your explanations with ones from other sources. Yeah.
Hank?
Well, of course, the way any society adopts, like how to do. I mean, ideally, you would have an input from a lot of different people, right? And so.
Hank?
Yeah. Okay. So many thoughts, but let me bring it into a suggestion of a what do we call it? A thought experiment. Okay. Well, let me say the first thing. The first thing is about fictional narratives. So I wrote a little thing in the chat. It says, data and facts do not make the world go round, it's opinions. Okay, that's the shorthand. In other words, it's about fictional narratives and they spread like wildfire. I forget the quotes of some thinkers about the facts don't do very much. Information, that's one. The other thing is changing minds involves intervening in a person's identity and their identifications that are integral to them and can't be separated from by the individual and especially the different size groups. But the thought experiment here is about us. If we became both thinkers and then action planners, like if we set up a work group that us becomes action planners about how do we get people, not how do we get, but how do we intervene to get people to think about accepting evolutionary biology, psychology, that realm, and what would happen to us as a group when we did that? Because we're good thinkers here and we come up with some great ideas, and it's not a criticism. I love it. But what if we wanted to do something? And so that would change our dynamic. Might be like Vassar. It might be the traditional psychoanalytic community. Just tell you one thing. There's a guy.
I don't mean to imply that Vassar is a traditional psychoanalytic community.
No,
No.
not
I don't
that.
think I
No,
said
just,
much about Vassar here.
no,
for the
no,
record.
not the psychoanalytic. That's a
Okay.
different subject. But there's a guy who's I don't know. His name is David Cellini. He's a guy in his mid-80s, and he started off studying psychoanalysis, and then he's moved around. He's a much more modern, practical, brilliant guy. So in the last Zoom I attended, he says he's I don't know. He's not worried about what he has to say anymore. So he says, I'm writing an article, and what is it called? Hidden in Plain Sight. And he says it in this very practical New York way. I can't understand how all these people have these classical analysts who follow Freud overlooked all the new discoveries since Freud. And he's finally coming out and talk about it. Now, I'd like to see the article and see how people react to him, but I like his thinking. So there's the thought experiment. Not that we're going to do it, because this is pretty valuable, but what if we took on a different role? We would change the goal of the group, the meaning that we give it, and also the impossible task of influence, and in relation to, I think Kathleen brought up the anxiety of influence. So there's
Hank,
my
are you saying like as a thought experiment, what if we did that? Or are you making a suggestion? I just want to make sure
I'm far from suggestions on this one.
Okay.
I just
Yeah.
suggest topics, but
Oh, okay.
it'd be fascinating. I mean, I don't know if it's feasible. People want it,
There are
but
people out there doing that, Hank.
yeah, I
I
know.
would mention particularly the work of an evolutionary psychologist whose name is Steve Stuart Williams. Stuart
Yeah, you
Williams.
mentioned him, Steve. Yeah.
He is a hyphenated last name, and he's written a book called The Ape That Understood the Universe. And if you want to give a introductory text to someone who knows nothing about evolutionary psychology, or give one to a critic that's willing to hear it well defended, that would be the book. I used to recommend The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, which is 30 years old, but I now would recommend Stuart Williams' book. And he has a new book about to come out sometime later this year, the title of which is A Billion Years of Sex Differences.
Oh,
in which he is going to directly address, sex versus gender, and all of that. So, at any rate, he has a Substack that is great. I'm a paid subscriber to it. He addresses things other than just EvPsych, but he's a really clear thinker and
right.
says things in a way that the average layman can understand. It's good work. So
Well, Steve,
there are people out
yeah,
there doing this work. Yeah.
right. But
Can you
Steve,
write his name in the chat?
Yes, I will. And then
Steve,
Alan, yeah.
can I just say something? I took you up on looking at Stewart's work, so I read some reviews, and then I got ChatGPT to give me a little summary, which was not bad. And then I asked ChatGPT to compare his work. I forget who the other evolutionary people were, and they gave me a little comparison, shorthand, longhand. It was very useful, but there isn't much there about what to do in all of these people.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of really smart everywhere. Every Zoom that I go to or group meetings, and it's all about the ideas, suggestions,
Hmm.
but what to do. I was listening to something about some scholar on Jew hatred, or what they call now anti-Semitism. He's brilliant, got some really good research, some data collection. I couldn't get my comment in. It was too late that I thought of it, but they have all these meetings, and they're really great meetings. I learn a lot
Hmm.
about more about this, in group, out group stuff on the big, but they don't, they're not saying, they say, well, what should we do to the guy? And he gives some general, nobody is really addressing I'm not saying they should. I'm saying they're not doing it. And I'm not taking the lead of the light brigade like you did, Kathleen, with that. But it's the doing that has
Well,
a whole different meaning.
we should all invite a friend to join Examine Lives, and then we can spread the word. That would be one thing we could do is
I
to
keep trying to
in,
get Judith Saunders to come. Judith Saunders is a well-known evolutionary psychologist, literary criticist, a
yes,
Oh,
Darwinian literary critic.
yes,
She's a friend of mine. She lives across the river, or we have lunch sometimes.
and I just extended an invitation by email to Laith Al-Shawaf, who wrote he's the evolutionary psychologist that wrote one of the resources I posted, which
Uh-huh.
was the one about the misconceptions about evolutionary psychology.
Okay.
Um, and whether or not he'll take us up on it or not, he was very cordial in his
Absolutely.
reply.
Yeah.
Anyhow, Alan, go ahead.
Well, so just a quick, I think it's a tag in from Hank to a certain extent. I want to thank Diane for tagging in for me last time. Where I wanted to go, and I think uh, uh, having this crew in on it rather than sort of the reduced, the Buddhist perspective, Hank's perspective, is if us versus them is kind of a baked in thing. If we're continually doing that,
I
what
think so.
what do we do at the individual level and then the level of a society to counter that? Because it's more like dealing with road rage than it is like dealing with a bad idea of some sort or another. So maybe, sometime out in the future, we could tackle that is mindfulness is a solution, is,
This
a particular type of education the solution.
this really goes to the heart of one of the interests I have in this, and what someone said it earlier, that we need to know what we're up against,
Yeah.
right? We need to know what we're up against. And this is another reason why I appreciate Quakers, because they have long experience of being up against certain things that they've developed strategies for. So, and this is certainly not blaming the victim, to get onto this touchy topic, but the recent murder by an ICE member of a protester. Her partner was baiting and taunting the guy who shot Good. I forget her first name.
Rebecca?
Rebecca, the partner of Good.
Renee Nicole.
Oh,
Renee Nicole. Okay, so her partner, if you look at the video, was baiting and taunting. Um, the Quakers understood that nonviolent protest is not merely refraining from violence. It is also enduring slurs, but not casting slurs. You have to know what you're up against. And
mhm.
I mean, for me, I would see this in terms of gender, among other things. Somebody who is, I mean, I would just see this as somebody possibly with a very threatened sense of his masculinity holding a gun. Um, and I mean, my understanding of psychobiological sex differences does play into that, how I would react to such a situation. But maybe that's too gendered. I think also when you're in a position of trying to bring about change in people who have more power, you would want to appeal to the better angels of their nature if you possibly could. They are either beyond hope, they don't have humanity, in which case taunting and baiting them is going to be a really bad idea, or they have a capacity for transformation, in which case it would be better to say, I hope you change your mind, or something. If you're going to say anything, um, nonviolent protest that Quakers and Buddhists and Martin Luther King understood the psychology of it, and I think evolution supports it, would be that if you're the underdog, especially in a situation, um, there are ways that are going to be more effective than others. Um,
Good point, Ken.
Okay, well, I was going to respond to something that Alan said, but Kathleen came up with a so much more important point. But I am going to go back to what Alan said, and that's that I had been giving a lot of thought to how do we deal with this tribal mechanism, and was actually thinking of researching for a presentation here on that subject. For a very long time, and I think a lot of other people thought that the obvious answer is, well, you break down the borders, you find a way to transcend tribalism. Perhaps mindfulness is, immensely useful. I know John Kabat-Zinn is doing that, addressing various governments in Europe. Um, but now someone at Oxford, on the name of Harvey Whitehouse, thinks that actually the best way is to evolve religion. And as you know, that if essentially we have this need for a group attachment, and that attachment is driven, the social control is driven by morality. Um, and And so perhaps evolving that, and this is not new because this is something that, what's his name, the fellow that David Sloan Wilson introduced us to, the Trappist monk, Wayne Teeves.
I don't
Well,
know.
anyway, it had talked about the same thing, essentially evolving all religions together, simply removing uh, the the conflicting part of it that my religion is better than yours, and as perhaps, for example, and I don't know if there are other ways, but I would just want to think it might be a nice idea, Alan, for one of us to research. Maybe it can be a cooperative effort to the various ways that are going about to transcend this tribalism we're
Well,
stuck
I'm
with.
looking at Diane's comment that isn't the pro-social movement about that. We're in the pro-social. Are we still? This is still part of pro-social world, isn't it? This
No,
form? No, it's
Yes,
not at
yes.
all.
No, it's not. No,
It's
it's not.
not at
But
all. It's
that's
independent
part
now
of
of
the.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Dave, that's another theory. David Sloan Wilson's theory is that a rapid cultural evolution can take place. We haven't seen it happen yet, but so that's one of the theories. So I think it would be nice to
Well,
itemize them all
that's
and at
what
least.
Project 2025 is trying to do, unfortunately, but with the idea of imposing a particular religion on everybody, which is really more about a set of behaviors and lip service to a certain Christian deity. But
um, Chris.
Of course.
Yeah, well, first of all, Ken, I think that's a lot to bite off to get religions to not think that people to think that their religion isn't the correct one, because otherwise, what's the point? But but I just wanted to just responding to Kathleen. I read a book a few years ago. It was called The Catalyst: How to Change Anyone's Mind. And it was actually, and just that taunting that you were talking about and all that. It I think it was written kind of as a marketing book, but there was a lot of psychology in it, and it seemed to really take into account what humans are like, and uh and was and an image in the book that was really helpful to me was a little football field that was an illustration, and the idea that the person that you disagree with is at a certain place is it maybe at the other end of the football field from you, and you're trying to get them to your end of the football field, but there's only this range in which they are able or willing to move at any given point in time, and if you try to get them to move further than what's possible for them in that moment, you create more resistance to what you're trying to do, and you end up with more work later. And so I thought that was and there, you know, the whole book is kind of along those kinds of that line, but I thought it was really helpful.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. I think we've veered a little bit off topic, which is fine. I just wondered before I mention what next month's topic is, I wonder, Kathleen, if you could just give us 3 minutes that kind of describes what Darwinian literary analysis does when it looks at a story or a movie and how that lens helps you interpret what's going on, because I find that quite fascinating.
So, Darwinian literary critics, okay, there are, I would say, three major things we do. One is that we relate features of literary text to evolved features of the brain. So, for instance, poetry, the repetition and rhyme and alliteration, you know, our brains evolved to identify patterns. So, one aspect of Darwinian literary criticism is not yet so much literary criticism as it is an understanding of the literary text, which can be oral or written. It can be a film. The idea is a story or a poem that we can understand, relate it to how our brains evolved. And another aspect would be understanding why we enjoy stories. So one aspect is just understanding in a general way what literature does and why for human beings. For instance, we evolved. It's an adaptation to be very interested in what other people do for obvious reasons to us, I think. And so by extension, we're very interested in stories. Stories can allow us to hypothesize without actually undergoing the risks that the characters undergo. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is to read a story and recognize certain evolved human preferences and aversions and behaviors that are depicted in the story, with the understanding that there are certain kinds of human activities and behaviors that are going to be really important to us, and therefore they're going to show up in stories most often. Love, mating, competition, um, searching for resources. There are certain kinds of themes that we're going to find in fiction more often. So a lot is just knowledge of who we are as a species, and bringing that to an appreciation of why we like stories or poetry. Okay. But in the
I
field
love
of
it.
literary criticism, have I gone over 3 minutes?
No, that's go
I
ahead.
told
Go
you.
ahead. Go ahead.
Keep going.
In the field of literary criticism, you know, this is where scholars engage with specific stories, and they're going to tease out various things to do with what the story might potentially mean, as opposed to what it seems to mean in a surface way, what the author might have experienced that went into the making of this story, what kind of culture the author was contending with at the time of writing the story. That's traditional literary criticism. And then a Darwinian approach would be to find intersections between aspects of our criticism and what we know about our evolved
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Kathleen,
storytelling.
I would love to come to a course you might do.
Yeah. Maybe
I would
we
have
could.
liked to teach such a course. I never
You
got to teach
would?
such a
I'll
course.
come.
Yeah.
I'll come. I'll get people.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe we can do at some point and examine lives on
Yeah,
Darwinian
I would
literary.
like to do that
That
sometime.
that would be
Darwinian,
fun.
because I could really share some things with you.
Mm,
It's really hard to
yeah.
Yeah. So
Let me just
um
so
add a tidbit, Steve. Just a quick tidbit.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
a comic, a British comic named Ricky Gervais. I don't know if
Oh,
anybody
sure.
knows,
Yeah.
but I just saw his new thing, and he was right up front with his understanding of what we study here,
Oh, yeah.
evolutionary biology about groups. So if you can on Netflix, just listen. He's a little bold and he's a little
Oh, yeah.
gruff, but he's insight
Yeah.
incisive and insightful. Okay, sorry.
I think the stand-up special you watched is called Mortality.
Yes, that's the
Yes.
one.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
recommend it. Just that part.
Next session, I will be leading a discussion on Harvey Whitehouse's ideas about what he calls wild religion, which is that religion is a byproduct of certain features of our brain and thinking that were adaptive, rather than religion being an adaptation by itself. So it's a different way of thinking about religion that I found it quite interesting. There's a chapter. His latest book is called Inheritance, and there's a chapter in that book in which he devotes it entirely to this topic. So that there you go. There's the book. Great book. So I'm going to kind of summarize his ideas, and then we will kick off a discussion about that.
My
So
library has that book. I'm going to go get it.
okay. So thanks everybody for coming
Thank you.
and keep trying to invite friends to grow our group. That would be great.
Yeah.
We are no longer part of Pro Social World. We're entirely on our own. If we can get some more people to come, that'd be great.
So our high-low thing is just high-low. It's not related to pro-social at all.
Well, I think we migrated to high-low when we were still part of Pro Social
Yeah.
towards the very end.
Oh, that's why I thought we were still
Right.
housed there
But
some way.
pro-social basically, there are a number of groups like ours that were incubated, if you will, in pro-social world. And they decided to kind of narrow their focus towards really leadership training for social action agents is really what they do.
Yeah.
And there were always two strains within pro-social world.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
kind of like this intellectual strain. There was
Kind of just want to talk about evolution and
there was an evolutionary
yeah.
philosophy group that I was
Yeah.
part of, and
That
our
was the
group.
Commons.
Yes, and there were a few others that were part of the larger
The
umbrella
book
was the
club.
pro-social
Yeah.
commons. The pro-social commons ended. So
I
they
know.
could devote everything towards we're going to train people to go out there and change the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if that's what you want to do, that's not who we are.
Yeah. No, I got
Yeah.
confused. I thought since we were still on high-low that pro-social world had left this on high-low as
No, yeah.
something, but it's not.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're just a bull session, but
Yeah.
hopefully a good one.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, stay safe out there.
Thank you all.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.